for coming to our panel. I'll introduce myself. My name is Courtney Davis, and I'm the Executive Director of Marijuana Matters, which is a DC-based nonprofit that works to ensure that social equity is at the cornerstone of the legalized cannabis industry. We do this work through our three pillars: education, advocacy, and entrepreneurship. And have been wanting to have a conversation around the role that the faith community can play in the conversation about decriminalization within the cannabis industry for a while. And so very excited to be here in New Orleans at this conference. This is a perfect backdrop for the conversation, considering incarceration rates in the state of Louisiana and just the opportunities for restorative justice, economic empowerment, and community reinvestment that cannabis industry can bring. And so I wanted to introduce our panelists here. They're all native, or not native, but local here in New Orleans and Louisiana area. I'll do ladies first. Reverend Elizabeth Magnum Lott has served as pastor of St. Charles Avenue Baptist Church since 2013 and helped launch the St. Charles Center for Faith in Action in 2019, where she now serves as Associate Director. Reverend Lott came to St. Charles with her family from Richmond, Virginia, where she earns a divinity from the Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond. She is a Gulf Coast native from Mobile, Alabama, and pursued her undergraduate studies in religion at Stanford University.
Not Stanford.
Stanford University, where she met her husband, Nathan. Where is Stanford?
Birmingham.
Birmingham.
Yeah.
Okay. My dad's from Birmingham.
Oh, cool.
So yeah. All right, we've got Dr. Reverend Connolly, who's currently serving as the lead pastor of Bethany UMC in New Orleans. He has pastored in Baton Rouge, New Orleans, LA, Dallas, Texas, and Raleigh, North Carolina. He is the owner of J.D. Connolly Law, LLC, and practices criminal defense and family law. He also has served as a consultant since 1994 for numerous nonprofits, emerging businesses, and the United Methodist Church, so wears many hats. And we also have in the center here, Ramon Richardson, who is the first African American to legally cultivate and process cannabis in the state of Louisiana. A native of Ponchatoula, Louisiana, he is the cultivation technician for Ilera Holistic Healthcare in Baton Rouge. Prior to joining Ilera, Ramon leveraged his education in chemical process technology into an opportunity to enter into the cannabis space as a processor, extractor, and later cultivation tech for GB Sciences, also here in Louisiana. He's also the founder of and CEO of Louisiana Oil and Gas Company. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for our audience. I wanted to just get started with our first question. We have kind of set the scene about being here in Louisiana and, have some faith leaders here, understanding that the faith community has a role to play in the conversation about decriminalization. So whether it's focused on re-entry community building, economic empowerment, just wanted to get you all's perspectives on what role can the faith community play in this conversation when we have an opportunity to use the legalization of cannabis to do some restorative justice work.
Oh, you want me to jump in first?
Yeah. What is the main word for the restorative justice?
Sure. Joe and I were part of an event recently about how to engage faith communities in the greater New Orleans area to learn and practice restorative approaches throughout the criminal legal system, making it less punitive and more restorative, just broadly. So I think any faith community that wants to be engaged in that conversation anyway, it's almost like the low-hanging fruit is to engage cannabis legalization and decriminalization in talking about how many Black and brown people there are in Orleans Parish Prison and in prison around the state. I was looking at Vera Institute's, they did a report 5 years ago in 2016 about marijuana in Louisiana, and of the felony convictions being given out in New Orleans, 93%, or I guess felony arrests and then moving into conviction, 93% of those are African-American men. And so there's obviously a huge racial component to this. So as a white faith leader of a white faith community, there's a lot of lip service being given now to anti-racism and how can we be an anti-racist institution? Well, there's no way to do that without engaging the criminal legal system and talking about drastic reforms. So I don't see how a person of faith cannot want to engage this conversation because it seems to me to be such a basic central part of honoring your neighbor and loving the people who are around you.
Okay. Yeah, I want to say education. I think that's the primary role, educating the community about the medicinal benefits, as well as, how it was used as a tool to harm our communities. And it's, like I say, it's a big opportunity to have restorative justice. It doesn't make sense for all these, lawyers and billionaires to actually come in and to make all this money. And, we were pretty much on the front line on the war on drugs. So I think restorative justice is important, the educational aspect of it, and also the economic empowerment that it'll actually bring. So.
I think I would ditto both of what they've said, but also going into the line of really getting involved and having conversations. We know that the majority of Black and brown families all across America have either had someone, family member in jail, visited jail, or on the way to jail. Because of this so-called war on drugs, which was a misnomer, it really became an economic engine for white businesses and white politicians who got filthy rich on what I call the new slave plantation. I would say if you have not read the book by Michelle Alexander, which is now in its 10th anniversary edition of the new Jim Crow, put that on your list to do on the plane going back home. It will change your lives. But having the perception of marijuana change in particularly Black communities when it comes to Black churches, we see from one perspective that if somebody is smoking marijuana, then they are a criminal, they don't deserve anything, and what they get is what they should get from the criminal justice system. However, when it hits our backyard and we're dealing with what we call the NIMBY syndrome, the not in my backyard syndrome, then we change. Now we want to get involved. Oh, the system is wrong. Well, the system has always been wrong. But the system is getting exactly what it's designed to get until now you are part of the system and now you want to speak out loud. And I'm one that the pastors around here know me. I speak things as they are. I put them on the table. It's hard finding clergy who will take a stand when it comes to marijuana. And so if you're not willing to be a voice for all of your people, then my thing is keep your mouth closed because you're losing the respect of the community. And we have a hard enough time in the church right now gaining that respect. But we need younger voices to be part of our congregations, which are predominantly older, dying congregations. I shared with our congregation, and I'll say this, we'll go to the next question. When I got the invite, I shared Bible study night with our congregation that I was going to be speaking, and there was an overwhelming, unanimous, Pastor, you have to go, because our folks are dealing with this, and you have to go speak. You have to have, and say, we know you're involved in reentry. The following Sunday, I did the same thing with our congregation at the end of our worship, and we're on Zoom. And then it was the same thing. And I did it to see what their response was going to be like, that their pastor was going to be making speaking on this panel. And they all were like, you have to go do it. You cannot stay away from it. And so this is where we are as a congregation.
I'm going to interrupt your flow because I want to ask a question about restorative justice that you would think would have come up in the past couple of weeks when we've been Zooming. But when we talk about restorative justice or restorative approaches, we're often talking about addressing the harm that has been caused. And in that conversation, we're talking about a victim and then somebody who caused harm to that person. And that's where the dialogue's happening. But when we're talking about cannabis in Louisiana, I mean, the harm that has been caused is to the person who is incarcerated, is to the person who is being criminalized. And so I wonder what restorative justice look like with that in mind? I mean, to me, it's exoneration, expungement, and reparations, which is a very different kind of conversation than we're going to sit in a circle and we're going to process our stuff and here's what you did to me and here's how I felt.
From the legal end, just this week, the city council here has, they've made an announcement in the spring, they're bringing legislation forward from the city for exoneration and expungements of those who were in the system before. The DA here, Jason Williams, has caught a lot of flack from other DAs and other parishes because he is not prosecuting what we call low-level or low-hanging fruit when it comes to marijuana uses. It's going to be a civil penalty, just like getting a speeding ticket. But the reality is, when you look at the industry, there's millions of dollars being made on the backs of black and brown men and women when it comes to marijuana. The outlying parishes, their jails count on the number of persons. It's $31.50 per day is the average what you're worth to somebody in a jail cell. So when you take that away, you're really hitting the economics. So we've got to take it away from what is it that smoking marijuana does to the economics of it. And the same thing does when you look at GCO and CCC, which are two of the leading companies when it comes to private prisons. Built into their contracts for municipalities to sell an existing prison and make it a private prison, there is a small piece of the contract here in Louisiana we came into in 2012 that says that the city or the state would maintain the prison at a 95% occupied rate, which means we're guaranteeing you for 20 years, 95% your prison's gonna be full. Well, the way to do that is not through murders, it's not through bank robberies, it's not through it's through marijuana uses. And so until we change that system, we're not gonna change. But the faith community has to get up and speak out loud. For years, generations, it's been the faith community that was involved in civil rights.
Right.
And so if you make this in that vernacular, then you can begin to change the people involved.
Ramon, did you
Yes, and I feel it's important too because I feel conflicted in this industry because one hand it's like, I get to participate, but on the other hand, I know I have brothers that's on the same street as me trying to make a living at this, and they can't even get in the industry because they caught a prior conviction or a prior arrest. And I just feel uncomfortable telling people sometimes, even though I'm doing everything legally, it just still has that stigma. And I would like to, to try the way to at least get them to participate in the industry.
Right, and one of the ways that we could talk about this is what is the right way to approach members of faith and the leaders? Because I think in the conversations that we've had with individuals, faith leaders, they've said, don't make this a moral issue. We don't want to talk about legalization. In my opinion, I think some of the entryways into having this conversation are through health and wellness, restorative justice. I envision churches having expungement clinics. We talked about having access to grant to do some of this really restorative justice work. But what are your thoughts about how do we start to begin to have this conversation where people feel comfortable that we're not talking about smoking weed? I even think that in re-education on this topic, on cannabis, that people all automatically think about smoking weed. That is one of the many forms of consumption, but it is so much more than that. And so I want to talk a little bit about ways, in your opinion, that you think that we could start to begin to have these conversations in a palatable way for faith communities.
Louisiana, our state legislature just barely missed passing and making marijuana as a whole legal in this state, like many other states have done. The conversation, I think, if you started from mass incarceration, the negative impacts on the black and brown communities, and begin to educate folks, that's the missing piece right there. We have medical marijuana in Louisiana is legal. A lot of our members are using, whether it's from cookies or brownies or gummies, however, or if it's liquid, they're using marijuana, but it's medical in my prescription. But Johnny and Susie on the street who are rolling and smoking, they're doing it illegal.
Right.
Well, it's still marijuana, but we've got to have the conversation. What's the negative impact? And we look at the economic impact of mass incarceration, then they're open for the discussion. But to say, well, we need to legalize marijuana, oh, it's a closed off discussion then from a lot of folks.
Yes, and it's kind of crazy because a lot of people don't even know, like, we have a medical marijuana program, but smokable flower is not even one of the delivery methods yet. That's going to be the delivery method available in January. But specifically for where I work for, and I want to give a shout out to our CEO of Alera Holistic Healthcare, Dr. Shauna Macias, for allowing me to be here. The products that we make, it come in different forms. Like we make tinctures, it's under your tongue, you can drop them, take them sublingually. Also gummies, and we have vaporized devices, metered dose inhalers. So, and we also have the products that we make. They also specific for different ailments. So, like we have one of our products called Hope. It's pretty much made for autistic community. We also have products for PTSD patients called Freedom and stuff for insomnia. So a lot of people just don't know the how the program works and how it benefits.
I'm thinking in a much broader sense. Walter Brueggemann is a elderly biblical scholar and just genius, particularly when it comes to translating Hebrew texts. And he said about the church should not be the happiest place in town, it should be the most honest place in town. And I think that that's a starting point for faith communities where there has been so much pretense of coming in with your best face on and your best clothes on and pretending you've got it together and not talking about your problems and not talking about your real life. So even the simple thing of me making an announcement last Sunday, I'm going to be part of this panel at this conference, there were just giggles throughout the room. Like, what are you up to, Pastor? What's going on over at the convention center? And that's, some of that is a generational shift, and that's very much how I try to lead, is being really honest about my life and hoping that in doing so I'm making room for others to be honest about theirs. And that, I think, becomes the framework, the groundwork for destigmatization. Because I know the personal stories of my congregation of who's using for medical reasons and who makes brownies at Jazz Fest and all of these stories. And so how do we talk about that? And just a lighter, much more playful way too about, I'm not here to judge your story. I want to learn from you. What's going on in your life? Share your heart with me. And then that is just such a different entry point into any conversation.
Yeah, and the education that we talked about needs to take place for the community, but also for the leaders. You know, you all are leaders in your church, but there is a hierarchy, so to say, within the denominations that sometimes folks run into issues about making public statements or run into issues about ways that they want to run their church in, when it comes to specific controversial issues such as this. Can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges and how we could maybe have the conversations at that level as well?
I think to go back to alcohol, you know, years and years ago when the temperance movement started, the United Methodist Church is one that was very involved in that. You still have the stigma of alcohol and faith, that there is this sense that you have to have everything perfect. And so leaders in some positions are protecting what I call the falseness, those false pretenses, that denominations are all straight and good to go. However, if denominational leaders, I've been part of the United Methodist Church, which is 90% white, but there are other denominations that are 90% white that I could not be a pastor of a white church in. So we deal with our reality and not what someone's false perception is, then it's there. If someone, Stevie Wonder would not need to know that I was black or white or green or blue, that I was an effective leader, an effective pastor. Elizabeth and myself are building a relationship, and she's here today because of that relationship. And I think we can have those conversations that are there. That's where it starts at. and even from the leaders, is dealing with our reality, not from a false perception.
Yes, and yeah, I think those conversations are real important, and especially the conversation that we have, like I say, with cannabis being used as a tool. We talked about this in the Zoom call. Where I'm from on the North Shore, there's this agent, DEA agent named Chad Scott. He was like if you know about him, he's like one of the most corrupt cops in like United States history. And I was ground zero from that. I have family members doing life sentences behind this corrupt cop. And he ended up doing, he just got sentenced to 13 years for, all kind of illegal stuff that the cop was doing. But that's a conversation that we have to have. Just that really breaks my heart. Just they use that as a tool to call us drug dealers, and while they're getting paid off of it now, they don't want to have us in the industry. So that's something that we need to take a look at.
Yeah, for sure. I don't really work within a denominational structure. So a long story that doesn't really matter for this context at all would be that our congregation was once Southern Baptist, and then as that denomination became more far right wing, we left, and we're just a freestanding Congregationalist Baptist church now. So it's really been up to me to determine what risks am I willing to take with my own career. I don't have a bishop over me, I don't have somebody else over me, and then I feel like why even, nobody my age goes to church, so if I'm gonna go to church, if I'm gonna be there, then we're gonna do something. Let's, we're gonna, if we really believe any of these old stories to have any kind of capital T truth, then they also need to be transformative and engaging real life as it is. So that's the winding road that got my congregation to a place of engaging the system of mass incarceration, period, and then breaking it into pieces to find out, which component do you feel led to engage? Does that get your?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just know that is, in our conversation, that is definitely something that's come up, and so I wanted to get your perspectives on that. Can you talk a little bit about the organization that I know that you guys have received grants to do some type of justice work? Can you talk a little bit?
So our congregation formed a nonprofit a couple of years ago, the St. Charles Center for Faith and Action. The president of our board is here today, Dr. David Robinson Morris, and we do have a grant from a local foundation to do work over the next 3 years, engaging faith communities or communities of conscience. Not everybody is in a church, but whatever kind of tradition of spirit-led work you're doing, to bring them in and talk about different elements of the criminal legal system, even just the process of what happens from the point of getting arrested to going to prison. And then also bringing in stories of directly impacted people to engage the participants who are at this retreat, which is Joe and his congregation were there a couple weeks ago, to feel that human connection. We're not talking about statistics, we're not talking about inventory, these are human lives. And so what is the point in someone's story that you personally feel compelled to engage? And then we continue to journey with those communities over a year as they're coming up with their own way of engaging the criminal legal system.
Yeah, that's really impressive, because I think one of the ideas that we have is to kind of have churches be able to do some of this, the work that you mentioned, more specific to cannabis, doing some of the expungement clinics and education, and being able to have funding to do that, because our organization plays a role. We're in this space in educating and advocacy, and I think we talked a little bit on our call about, okay, we all know the issues here at hand, like what specifically can we do here in Louisiana? And I just wanted to make sure that folks knew about our organization, other groups like M4MM, Minority Cannabis Business Association. We are some of the smaller minority-led organizations that are working in this space and that are hoping to create these different stakeholders that can be activated across the country. I know M4MM has a chapter here, but just wanted to make sure that we were leaving folks with some actionable items here before we ask for questions from the audience. And so, Ramon, I wanted to get a little bit more about learn a little bit more about your nonprofit or the organization that you have, or is it your business? Sorry.
Yeah, well, the reason is actually a consulting company.
Okay.
And it's basically showing people how to set up grow operations, set up the front office for cannabis grow and stuff like that. I'm just getting started, and I'm actually was talking to Rev about starting up a nonprofit because I also want to give back. Because, like I say, it bothers me that I get to do something that I love and it's still being stigmatized. But so I definitely would like to get back, and we're gonna have further discussions on how to do that.
We have a group called, our nonprofit is called Action Empowerment. Action stands for a change that improves our neighborhood. We focus on economic development and reentry. One of our main partners right now is Toshiba International Corporation, the copier company and computer company. We're able to do job training development for copy repair technicians. We also partner with Toshiba that now for nonprofits that are connected with larger groups, there is a 70 to 75% off price break for equipment. And what we're looking at in nonprofits is there's a lot we want to do, but financing becomes an issue. Grants go to larger, well-known organizations, but a lot of the work's been done by smaller nonprofits. I'll just put it that way. And we need the grants, we need the network, and we need the association because we're having those frontline, day-to-day opportunities. Even folks in our audience might want to say, hey, well, look, I want to be involved in a nonprofit. Volunteerism. And that's the big word, except for we call ours unpaid staff. We give everybody a job description. You have hours that you are to work and to do. And the reason we do that is very simple. If you are a volunteer, you're kind of doing what you want. When you're unpaid staff, we have accountability. And then you can fire unpaid staff. You cannot fire a volunteer. The other reason is when a grant comes in, part of that grant is for staffing. And if we have unpaid staff, then it's easy. It's just a flick of a pencil to go from an unpaid staff position to a paid staff position. And so that's where we want to make sure that we're connected with folks who have the same like-mindedness, which is reentry is one of our big things that we're dealing with.
Okay. What advice do you guys have for folks that are in the audience or that may be listening later that want to get involved or want to have these conversations within their faith communities? What advice do you have for them on how they can kind of have that conversation?
Have the conversation first with yourself. Know what risks that are out there and be willing to take the risk and to take the heat for.
What do you think some of those risks are?
Well, it depends on if you're in, let's say, denomination, and your denominational leaders don't agree with you, but if that's where you feel led to do, then you take the risk. You could lose your assignment. You could lose your current job. But if you've done the work, you have other replacement avenues. The risk is that there are folks in your congregation who don't agree with you. But one of the philosophies that I teach in our congregation is we don't have to agree on everything, and our disagreements will lead us to development, not destruction. I don't want you to agree 100% with everything I say or do, because then I don't grow and neither do you. So those are some of the things you have to be willing to understand. Ostracism is another one. Within your colleagues who don't agree with you, they might not invite you to the luncheon or the breakfast or the meetings, and you have to be okay with that. At least time for the others.
Yeah, I would just say be open and don't judge, because we all still learning. And I understand where a lot of the stigmatism come from in the community. They scared. A lot of the people been locked up, so it's like, oh, don't mess with that. That's the devil and all that. But they don't understand it's been a medicine longer than it has been illegal. So I would just say don't judge. And, ask questions and get educated. So that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think, Joe, something you said, I think I'm also a pastor who's quick to tell people to leave their church. Like if you're in a community of faith that is not leading from love, then you really should also be reconsidering what you're doing with your time and your investment. Like, are they even worthy of your friendship and relationship in that community? If ostracization is really on the table, if getting kicked out of a community for telling the truth about your life is really on the table, then I would go so far as to say maybe you need a new circle of friends. Within that congregation, know who your trusted people are. If you're in a small group study, start out with those folks. But if you can't tell the truth about your life with anybody at that faith community, that's a bigger problem than decriminalization and legalization and all this other stuff we're talking about.
That's right.
And I think it's really significant.
That's a fair point. And so many of us are struggling with being honest about, for so long I've struggled about being honest. I even have some friends, I post about the session and they're like, you work on me? And it's like, yes, I do. And you have to be willing to explain, the work that you do and why it's important to you, and then not really care about someone else's opinion about, how you make your life and what you're drawn to do.
Well, and I think what Ramon is saying too about talking about the medicinal history and the very medicinal uses is such an important way of entering this conversation too, instead of just looking at recreational use.
Right.
And that's where it really differs from the prohibition to legalization of alcohol category. There are not really arguments to it. Maybe a hot toddy when you got some congestion, right? That's about it. And so I think that becomes a really important part of education too, is learning. And I'm very much just a student. You could teach me a lot, I'm sure. And then be able to speak about that candidly with your people.
Yes, and so just one thing too is like people like judging me. I'm coming home from a harvest and I'm reeking and people moving away like it's not what you think. Like
I have a W-2.
right, I have a W-2 and they just moving away. I'm like, it's work. It's medicine. It's actually medicine.
And then you have CBD, which is now more accepted in the community.
You can buy it at Whole Foods.
But the understanding and the teaching of that CBD oil, a lot of it still has 0.03% of THC in it, which is part of marijuana. But it's education, it's perception, it's marketing. We have to get the industry to where it's doing more of that.
Right. And churches have you guys work, I won't say you guys, but I know the churches have education opportunities to educate their, they work a lot with health groups, a lot of health fairs that states have, they'll make sure that members from the congregation can attend. So one of the things that I hope is that, cannabis organizations or nonprofits like Marijuana Matters will be able to have some partnerships with faith communities in order to have a safe space, a space that seems professional and legitimate. I think the industry sometimes has a legitimacy issue, and folks are, similar to what you said, Ramon, like, I have a legitimate job and people are still thinking that you're on a quarter board or something.
Right.
So, really hoping that by having this conversation, which is one of the first of many installments, that we can begin to start to get the ear of folks that are really going to be interested in learning more, as you mentioned, like just wanting to, be a sponge. I wanted to see if folks in the audience had any questions, or if people just wanted to talk a little bit about their relationship with faith, with their faith community and cannabis, or if they had any questions for the panel.
My name is Eric Waldman. I'm a black Catholic from the north, from Detroit, to be honest. And my question to you is, and I'm also a grower, I want to know, how do you link scripture with the job that you do as far as trying to spread the information and take away that stigma as far as, cannabis?
You look like you're making eye contact with me.
Anyone.
Well, which piece of it? You mean like the whole thing, the specifically the growing piece, a lot of what we've talked about with mass incarceration, that piece. Okay. Well, I thought we might go there, and so I pulled up. So I teach in the Jesus tradition, which means I'm looking at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. What did Jesus say? What did Jesus do? The very first thing that Jesus preached when he is starting his ministry comes from the prophet Isaiah. So he goes into the temple and he picks up this scroll of Hebrew scripture, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Then he began to say, "The scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Which is a pretty badass move. That he picks up their own scripture and is like, "This is why I'm here. This is what I am about." And so if your faith is not doing that work, working to actively set people free, undo whatever systems of oppression that there are, then what good is it? So that to me is foundational. And I suspect, Joe, you might talk about Matthew 25.
Well, and that same thing, we have, that's a longer discussion topic than we have here. But just in a nutshell, you'll have what's called proof texting. And proof texting is where individuals will find a piece of scripture to support their topic or their stance. But we got to go into the historical aspect of Scripture and realize where it is. And that Scripture itself has been used to support institutional systems of injustice, institutional racism. If we go into some congregations, we talk about the King James Version of the Bible and why it only shows pictorially the very tip of Egypt, but they don't really talk about Egypt as really North Africa. So there's a whole different piece when you talk about Scripture. That Scripture's been used to subjugate an entire generation or an entire nation of people to being less. But that same people, they were the ones that God chose in the very beginning to be God's people. So there's a whole, that's a real loaded topic of discussion. And some of us are attacking that. All of my education from ministerial, my master's, my doctorate, was from white institutions. And we did not have those discussions in detail. When I went to law school, I chose a black institution to have those conversations. And so scripturally, again, it's proof text. You go to the Catholic Church, and when I was at Cornerstone United Methodist Church in New Orleans from 97 to 2000, we had 200 Catholics that would come to our services every single week. They would participate in all of our ministries, but they would not leave the Catholic Church because to do so, grandmama and granddad and auntie would turn over, they would say. But they would start to learn the Bible for themselves instead of being dictated by the priest of that local congregation. So you've got some differences there in understanding. And I think that's where it comes. When you start to read for yourself, you'll come into a whole new understanding of Scripture within that context.
No, I would think the Jesuits are out there,
Would do
though,
that, yeah.
being radical with the Bible and teaching
Yeah.
people to read. I want to be fair to our Catholic
You
siblings.
start to learn some of them, some sects on it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, outstanding. Thank you.
And to make it simple, just healing. That's what the plant does, is healing. I know it sounds simple,
Yeah.
but
Healing of the nations. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi. So my name is Bobsy. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a huge cannabis advocate. I work in the industry as an educator. I'm a trainer, and I teach client experience, Cannabis 101, all kinds of stuff. And so this conversation for me is very transformational.
Yep.
Because I have a lot of religious trauma. And through that experience, we talked about ostracization, being ostracized from the church, based off of like what you've experienced in your personal life, and we talked about leaving, which I went through that whole journey. I was an early mom, they kicked me out of choir, they didn't want to baptize me, like it was bad. And so eventually, that didn't even lead me to leave the church. Eventually I left the church though, and started to kind of seek my own spirituality. And I think what happens, I'm from the Seventh-day Adventist faith. And I think what happens is like being so dogmatic and so drawn to like very specific doctrine, rather than the spirit of the person that you're trying to witness to or speak to, we've lost the spirit, I think, of religion. I don't do religion anymore, y'all. I'm just being clear about that. But I do God, and I do understand that we talk about, oh, we can't judge, we're not the judge, but we do it so hard. Like, the system is built to judge you. You know, and so when we're talking about having honest conversations in regard to cannabis and in regard to the plant is something that, so I don't know if you guys are familiar, I'm sure you are, sir, like with the endocannabinoid system, our bodies are literally built to take this as medicine. It's already in us. And so when we can teach from that medicinal standpoint while also eliminating the stigma of med versus rec, too, that's a big thing that propaganda has created. It's the same plant. And generally, people who are trying to use this plant are using it for very similar reasons, whether it's to help them with sleep, with anxiety, with pain. Because
Yeah, let me, because of our time, let me go to and ask you specifically, what's your question?
it's more of a comment on approach on how to have the conversation within the church by approaching it from like a community health standpoint and understanding that it's not, because you know, we talk, I think the church is about the letter of the law. And we're so like, okay, well, the government has told us this is what it is. And so for me, I think it's just helping people to understand that it's back to the roots. It's back to, this is something that was grown and that's already within our human bodies to use as medicine. I don't know. I had a whole lot, but I feel you understand. But yes.
I mean, I would say the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict yesterday is a great example of just because something is determined to be legal does not mean that it's determined to be moral.
Right.
Which is something that I will certainly be talking about in my pulpit tomorrow. And so I think that that's also something for congregations to reclaim their prophetic passion, reclaim prophetic imagination, that we're supposedly, we say we're part of some other vision of the world and not just this empire. And so what are the parts of this empire that might be legal but are absolutely immoral? And yeah, I mean, I could speak to a lot of what you shared, and I'm sorry that you had those experiences in faith communities. Unfortunately, it's very common.
You know what? I've learned so much and thrived through all of that. So I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? I know some folks, I realized that you guys may have been in like other sessions for a while, but just wanted to give folks an opportunity to ask any questions they may have, or if they just wanted to talk about their experience with faith in cannabis, or what brought them here. You know, this is, you know, we're just hoping to have a little bit more of a dynamic conversation here, not a lot of structure. So if anyone else is willing to share.
So what I'll share is, and Elizabeth doesn't even know this, but my grandmother got us to sort of smoke her whole life. So I lived in a house with a woman who actively smoked her whole life, with relatives who actively smoked their whole life, right? Very much a Black Catholic household. And I had an Aunt Beth who was 89 years old, who was the mother of her church, and would come over on a Sunday morning after church and roll a joint, cross her leg, drink her coffee, and have Sunday dinner with us, right? And my grandmother was very clear that we are Catholic, but we're Black first, right? You were born Black, you were made Catholic. There's an in-body knowing that we have to tap into. And she would often say to me, I became very judgmental at some points in my life, right? As we all get there. And she said, you know, Black folks are older than the concept of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So we know things that you don't think we know. You're letting an institution, institutions by their very nature are oppressive, move you into this certain realm. And I would say, well, why do we still go to church? So we go to church for community and to receive communion, and then we get our ass out of it. So those are, you know, these ways of living and knowing are existing always. And of course, some cousins who are sister-in-laws who, were locked up for years because of selling, right? Because they were corner pharmacists. And in a way, my great-grandmother who never understood this would say, well, you shouldn't be doing that shit.
Right.
But I don't think they should lock you up for 20 years because you sold some weed on the corner. So all of these things in what would seem like very normal households, right, have always existed, compared in relationship to religion. That sometimes you just have to say, listen, that shit ain't about me.
Right.
Right? I love the community, but what y'all talking I ain't hearing it right now. And what I do know is that the church that is not focused on equity and justice is a church that has become irrelevant. And I think we have to stop talking about that.
Oh, wow. That was deep.
Strong.
Super true. So I'll make mine kind of because we came a little bit late, but so two things. I got a question and then a piece to relate. I grew up in independent African American Catholic, right? I was just talking to my cohort member about it. So I grew up with the dichotomy of traditional Catholicism versus Pan-Africanism, and I grew up in a very strong Black-rooted family. So cannabis was always kind of taboo, but also all my cousins, all my uncles, and everyone else was involved in that. So I think it's a really important conversation to have in the faith community because it happens right in our own homes. And I don't necessarily think that people in the congregation are comfortable talking about it. So fast forward to this year, I was able to talk to a very progressive leader in the faith community and have a dialogue about cannabis and how some of his congregation is using it, and they're talking about it on the hush-hush, right? So being able to have those conversations out front are very important. And, I'm in Baltimore, so it's a huge, Catholic town, and everyone's talking about cannabis, but they're not talking about how they're using the cannabis. I think that's the biggest part to breaking the stigma, is having those conversations out loud, no matter what the condition is. So my question to y'all is, and maybe you talked about this before, how do you have those conversations, especially with the faith leaders who know that congregation is complete, have that conversation with the progressive faith leader was easy, shout out to Pastor Heber Brown, but he's one of the few in a town where, everything is led from the top. So I'll have my question.
Yeah, we talked earlier about just having the real conversation, dealing not with the perception that's out there, but the reality. And for some folks, that perception is their reality. And so you start the conversation with where they are. For me, our law practice, our scriptural foundation is Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require? And we have 3 words: justice, faithfulness, and equity. And in those conversations, understanding and realizing some of these people are our friends and colleagues in ministry, but they're completely on different levels of where we are. Again, one of the statements I said earlier is our disagreements will lead us to development, not destruction. And I have friends that are like, Joe, why are you doing this? And not cannabis. Why am I dealing with reentry? Why am I a pastor and a lawyer? Some folks can't see those two operating together. And I'm like, because your perception of a lawyer is screwed and your perception of a pastor is screwed. But when you put the two together, they're like, well, man, that doesn't work. Well, it does work because the morality works. And so having that conversation first, realizing where people are, and then talking about and going from there. That's how I do it. Ramon?
Yeah, I would just say the conversation, you can have the conversation from educational perspective, the benefits of it, and like you were saying, the reentry and the harms that the war on drugs had, and things of that nature.
Yeah, we haven't really even talked about that.
Right.
I think just continuing to tell the truth about your life is big for me. I had a clergy lunch this week with 8 different faith leaders and told them about being on this panel on Saturday, and immediately the conversation was about, I'd lose my job, I couldn't be there. But so just to continue putting it out there in whatever circle that there is. And I mean, ultimately taking more risks, like if you determine like half a Delta 8 helps you sleep at night, or helps you get through that business meeting or whatever it is, to be able to start saying things like that and then realize somebody else has something to add. I I don't know how to do it other than being honest and having honest conversations, and being willing to shoulder whatever the consequences are from that.
And bringing the facts in. More folks have died from the use of legal alcohol than they have from cannabis.
Yeah.
And really understand the impacts of the two. And the journey that cannabis is taking right now is the same journey that alcohol took generations ago. And if you still go into some black communities and brown communities, alcohol is still the illegal side of the home brew that's not regulated, not because of a health issue, but because of a taxation issue. Louisiana missed making marijuana legal in this state during the legislature, not because of conversations or differences, whether it was medicinal or not, but how to tax it. So they've taken the conversation to economics, which has always been a conversation in the black community. And a lot of our churches, we've sung songs by John P. and New Life Community Singers. And many don't know that John was the largest drug dealer from Charlotte, North Carolina to Durham, North Carolina, which is about a 2-hour swath of interstate. But he got his life changed around, and a lot of the same individuals that he had in his choir were folks that he was selling to on the streets. But because he had that relationship, they could come and do a different level. So that's what it's got to go to.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback off of the education point that you mentioned. It's like anything. When you come to someone, it's best to have your facts together. How are you going to present your argument? How are you going to convince someone of something that's controversial? And I talked a little bit earlier about how the industry needs more validators. It's really crucial that faith leaders are here openly talking about this, because people really respect the opinions and the thoughts of folks within their congregation that they are following. Also, their doctor, their nurses, and so a lot of the folks that are here for this conference are trying to absorb that education so that they can become validators for folks in their community, because you can't ignore the facts. I mean, people may choose to not want to understand it or not to relate to it, but the facts are the facts. And I also think that I'm not sure where the industry is going to be in 10 years, but it's not going to go back to not having access to cannabis. So it's only a matter of time when folks will eventually be able to stomach the conversation and actually think about it. And Elizabeth, you mentioned that we didn't really talk about like the impacts of the war on drugs, but one of the things that we really like to discuss are the collateral consequences of the things that happen after you've served your sentence or you've had an arrest. And those impacts don't happen just to that individual. Those are also, a person could be incarcerated and now their mother or their grandmother has to raise their children. That's an extension of those collateral consequences, because they're now having to have more income, or they're now dealing with the social issues that come with not being raised around, two-parent households, or having a parent that's incarcerated. So there's a lot of those stories that we're trying to tell, because I think that it really humanizes the issue and will allow people to feel a little bit more compassion when you're able to have those conversations with them about cannabis.
So, John, we're up.
I guess we're up for our time, but I'm so glad that folks came. I don't know if anyone wants to, if we want to just do like maybe last thoughts before folks leave. I guess I will make one plug for our organization. We have a social equity toolkit that's available on our website, and it's essentially a guideline for recommendations, policy recommendations that we have for public institutions. We have recommendations for community members, which includes the faith community, and also private industry, on ways that they can become engaged on these issues in creating social equity within the industry. So final words from anyone?
I would just say, I know we had back and forth about what's medical use and what recreational use. I would say all cannabis use is medical use, in my opinion.
Okay.
And I think education and conversation, I think that's what, for me, is what it is.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you guys so much for coming. Round of applause for our panelists. Yes, I'm very excited to, continue this conversation, and hopefully if folks want to come up and ask any additional questions or get contact information, we'll be here. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.